Great. Welcome to the very first Lancet Commission on Gender and Global Health seminar to everybody around the world, from the UK to Australia and all places in between. We're delighted that you're able to join us today. And we are delighted and honoured to open our seminar series with Professor Raewyn Connell. So just as a very quick way of introduction and a little bit of housekeeping before I pass over to Raewyn, the Lancet Commission on Gender and Global Health is co-chaired by Professor Pascal Alotti at the United Nations University Institute of Global Health in Kuala Lumpur, Assi El Haj, based in Dakar, Senegal, who is the chair of the Kofi Annan Foundation, and myself, Sarah Hawkes, at the Centre for Gender and Global Health at University College London. So Professor Raewyn Connell, I think it would be very, very hard for me to give an introduction that really does justice to Raewyn's astonishing career, pushing forward the boundaries of knowledge and understanding and expectation around the topic of gender, the topic of masculinity, class theory, Southern theory. I'm gonna stop there with all of just a small inkling of all of the topics that Raewyn's career has covered and has served as a centre point for understanding for many of us working in the field of gender and health. So just as a very quick piece of housekeeping, this seminar will last for about 30 minutes. Raewyn is going to talk for about 20 minutes. There will be an opportunity for some question and answers from everybody who is joining us on YouTube. If you have questions, I would strongly encourage you to put those questions onto the YouTube chat as we go along. We're actually joining via Zoom, and there is a slight delay between the YouTube channel and Zoom. So if you could get your questions in before the 20 minutes is up, that would be extremely helpful in order to avoid delays at the end. But right now, with no further ado, I will hand over to Raewyn. Thank you, Raewyn.
Okay, thank you kindly. I'm going to use a little PowerPoint presentation. So I will start with my rather wobbly technology by attempting to go full screen. I hope this is actually coming through correctly. I thought we needed to start our discussions by reflecting on the kind of knowledge that is involved in a project like this commission. And the best place to start that was with the Lancet itself, which is an institution that embodies a certain way of understanding and using knowledge, a way that's gestured towards, I suppose, by the rhetoric of science-led policy and practice, evidence-based health practices, excellence in research, and so on and so forth. You know this rhetoric very well. I'm very familiar with it too. It points towards a particular way of organising knowledge that I call the research-based knowledge formation. And I'm familiar with that because I'm a researcher too. I've all my career been engaged in research within this general formation of knowledge. And it is the pattern of knowledge that's dominant in the university curriculum and in most academic publications. So it's not surprising that that has Model of knowledge has been strongly deployed in response to the COVID-19 epidemic, with, of course, considerable effect, as the virologists in particular have got to understand and communicate to the rest of us something of what's happening with the nature of this entity, organism is. But that pattern of research has not got the same kind of grip, although it might have a considerable intellectual grip on the virus. It doesn't have the same kind of grip at present on the social disaster that has accompanied the spread of this particular virus, because I think the disaster we're facing is in fact principally a social one, characterized by chaotic decision-making in many of the major states of the world, the spread of systematic lying, sometimes by heads of government, who seem at times to be actually on the side of the virus rather than on the side of the humans. And we're now, of course, seeing desperate inequalities in the process of distribution and access to vaccines. So we're in a situation where some of the familiar forms of knowledge are not giving much of a grip on what is happening. And this is, of course, an issue about gender and health, as we know. As I understand the statistics, there are not very large differences between men and women as groups in the rate of infection globally, though there are differences in mortality once infected, which seem to suggest men are more vulnerable in some ways, though why is greatly debatable. But that way of understanding the relationship between gender and this disaster that we're facing is itself a very limited one if we just look at gender differences in physical impact of the disease. Because there are big gender effects in other aspects of what's happening as the health workforce is deployed or redeployed to cope with the COVID-19 outbreak. We are deploying a strongly gendered workforce because health services are among the most starkly gender divided sectors of modern workforces. State decision making, with all its chaotic character, is happening in institutions which are mainly dominated by men, and not by men in general, but by men in particular cultures and styles of masculinity, some of which definitely contribute to the chaotic decision making. And we're dealing with institutions like corporations, the biomedical corporations involved in producing vaccines, which of course have their own patterns of power. They too are largely dominated by particular groups of men. And it seems to me that the connection between the epidemic and gender patterns, gender dynamics in this dimension is, if anything, more important than in the physical dimensions of the epidemic. It's really striking to me, in fact, how little we've seen in the response to COVID-19 of the lessons that were learned in previous epidemics and pandemics, such as the HIV pandemic and the Ebola virus outbreaks, of the importance of community responses, of the knowledge and capacities of communities to understand what's happening and to generate their own protective responses. For some reason, the character of the responses mainly to depend on authority, and that itself has produced social problems around the epidemic. Okay, well, coming back to the organisation of knowledge, the research-based knowledge formation has a history of something like 500 years. And it has a very special social context, which I think is very important to us in wrestling with issues about gender and health. That is the context of the expansion, the global expansion of European empire, the conquest and colonization of very large parts of the world and large parts of the world's population, directly or indirectly. Now, this process is itself a gendered one. And here I will start my little slideshow if I can. No, it's not liking me. I do not know what to do about this. I can't do the slideshow.
Click the arrow in the bottom corner, left corner, Raewyn.
This one. Got him?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well done. I'm using the wrong device. Okay, this is a picture of the colonisation of Australia in the 19th century by British colonisers. And it illustrates one important social fact about colonialism, that it was involved gendered workforces, and particularly the process of conquest itself was very strongly masculinized. The disruption of gender orders among the colonized led to the production of new gender orders in colonial societies, whether settler colonial or societies created by conquest. In the fullness of time, as the old empires ended and post-colonial societies of various kinds were created, the new gender orders carried through into the post-colonial period, rather than, of course, you could not have a reversion to an earlier historical period. I want to mention here a really important concept developed by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, the concept of the coloniality of power, which has now been applied to the concept of the coloniality of knowledge and of other kinds of institutions. The basic idea is that in the context of empire, institutions and power structures in the colonies were built around the relationship with the metropole, with the imperial centre. And this pattern persisted in the post-colonial period. That's what Quijano means by the coloniality of power. It's not just under colonialism, but in post-colonial time too. And that is a very important point, as we'll see, in relation to knowledge. The research-based knowledge formation was created within this framework of empire, within this context of empire. And it was created as a masculinized and colonial system of knowledge. I'm going to show you a picture of the crew, one of the key moments in the creation of research-based knowledge formation. An episode in the early 19th century where a British naval vessel went off on a tour of the colonial and post-colonial world to collect data for a range of sciences, having on board a young biologist by the name of Charles Darwin, who's aboard the ship. You can't see him, but you can see the mountain in the background, which is in southern Chile. That process that Darwin was involved in, which was crucial, of course, to the development of evolutionary biology, went on for hundreds of years in the time of empire and in post-colonial times as well. It is, in fact, still happening that the colonized and post-colonial world serves the research-based knowledge formation mainly as a gigantic data mine. There is a massive flow of data back to the imperial centre, to the global north. And one consequence of that is the growth of a division of labour between the collecting of data and the process of theorising, of collation of data, application, the development of applied sciences, which largely happen in the global metropole, in the imperial centre. So there's a global division of labour in knowledge, which is created in the history of imperialism, which persists in knowledge institutions into the present, and which creates for knowledge workers in the majority world, the periphery, a pattern that has been called academic dependency or extroversion by different analysts. One of the key reasons why this persists is the institutional pattern of communication that's grown up within the research-based knowledge formation. Here's a map of the world developed by a couple of ingenious geographers, British geographers, showing the countries of the world with area proportional to the number of knowledge-based journals that they publish. And you can see in this the immense preponderance, especially of the English-speaking countries of the global north, but of the global north generally, in comparison with the rest of the world. Although the population map of the world would look almost the negative of this. So what we see then is a kind of patterns of inequality, of difference of function, which are built into, at a global level, built into the pattern of knowledge, the knowledge formation that has become dominant in our thinking about knowledge in the curricula of the global university system. And with the dominance of this pattern of knowledge, we see also a historic pattern of the marginalization, if not complete discrediting and rejection, of the other patterns of knowledge, the other knowledge formations, which were in existence and have continued in existence through the 500 years of recent world history. And I will be giving some examples in a moment, but I want to indicate first that there are, in fact, a variety of different forms of knowledge which provide information of a variety of kinds, which represent knowledge in a variety of ways different from that of research-based knowledge formation. There are alternative universalisms, often associated with widespread religions. There are forms of local practical knowledge, the knowledge of sea and biology, for instance, which is held by fishing communities. And there are many forms of indigenous knowledge which pre-existed the process of colonization and which survived within indigenous communities, even under the very devastating impact of colonial conquest. And I want very briefly to illustrate that with a painting that was done by 3 Indigenous women in an Australian Central Desert community, a style that some of you will probably recognise. It's not widely known that this kind of painting actually embeds a great deal of knowledge of country, knowledge of food sources, knowledge of social relations too. And this particular painting, which is called Sugar Leaf Dreaming, embeds such knowledge from women's point of view. It is in fact a strongly gendered painting representing women's knowledge of particular kinds of food sources, the geographical knowledge of how to find them, the ceremonies through which that knowledge is passed down from time to time, and the social know-how about how to deal with the gender problems, the problems of gender relations that are narrated in the traditional stories that go with this design. So here we have, significant, highly developed, often very sophisticated forms of knowledge. which have very systematically been marginalized by the dominance of research-based knowledge formation, and which we should understand as resources for dealing with contemporary problems, I would argue. But the crucial form of knowledge, which I think is tremendously important for the contemporary development of gender understandings, is what I call Southern theory, and that is the work of intellectuals, of knowledge workers in post-colonial, formerly colonized societies, responding to the conditions created by the history of colonization. And I want to run through, and I will do this very quickly indeed, some of the issues about gender and health that come up in the work of thinkers in colonial and post-colonial societies dealing with gender issues. For instance, one of the key issues of gender and health in much of the world is questions of nutrition and food security. We all know this, and we're all familiar with the gender division of labour in households and in occupations which are associated with the production and distribution of food. Now, one of the crucial political issues which connects with this is gender-based land rights. And here I want to bring to people's attention the work of Bina Agarwal, Indian economist, development economist and environmental researcher, who's done absolutely wonderful work on gender and land rights across South Asia. Stunning stuff, which has looked at the intimate and the large-scale politics of women's access to ownership of and use of land, and the way the politics of gender plays out in relation to food and food production. That's one of the kinds of issues which are very marginal in global North discourses, but which are of enormous importance around the global South. One that is familiar in the global North, another issue, is of course that of gender-based violence, of direct harm through violent action. We have our quantitative models of gender-based violence and its causes developed in the global North, and useful they certainly are for making policy in the global North. But I haven't yet seen one of these models that actually has colonization as a variable. And colonization is in fact one of the historic backgrounds, one of the historic sources of contemporary patterns of gender-based violence. This is an argument very strongly made in the African context by Amina Mama, an important feminist thinker from Central Africa. Related arguments are made about Afro-descendant populations in the Americas by scholars such as Mara Viveros from Colombia, who's worked on the, among other things, and the experience of violence by Afro-descendant women in communities in relation to land, because these issues, of course, do link up in practice, and the connections with the patterns of masculinity, which is one of in which Mara is one of the truly important contemporary researchers. Thinking further about masculinity, we have to face issues about the marginalization of particular populations and the gendered impact of particular patterns of colonization in post-colonial social relations. In Australia, for instance, the looking at different demographic groups, the one which has the worst health outcomes of all in the country is Aboriginal men, who have an average expectation of life of 10.6 years less than the average of other groups. It's a profound health issue, which is very inadequately dealt with by governments in Australia. Now, some of the arguments about health impacts for men focus a lot on the idea of traditional masculinities being unhealthy or source of problems in health. And sometimes there is a case to be made for this, but there are also complexities in notions of traditional masculinities that we need to think about. And here I would call attention to the work of Kopano Ratele, a psychologist from South Africa, who I think is one of the most interesting writers about masculinities today, who's argued that traditions are a great deal more plural and complex than we typically assume in gender analysis, and that they are negotiable in the present in very interesting and sometimes progressive ways. Okay, well, I'm running short of time, I realise, and I'm going to skip over an argument that I wanted to make about trans rights as a health issue and the way that needs to be understood in Global South contexts. We can come back to that in discussion if you'd like. But I want to move then to the final points that I want to make. For the lessons, if you like, of the issues I've been traversing. First of all, we need to attend to knowledge that comes from the South, which may change agendas in gender and health, may change our concepts, because the concepts that work in the global North may simply not work in much of the majority world. We certainly need to look beyond a concept of gender as involving individual bodies or individual identities. We need to think about the gender patterns in structures of the economy, of institutions, of our relations with the environment. And finally, we need to recognise that there are perpetrators out there, that there are people who benefit from gender inequalities, who draw dividends from the existence of inequalities and marginalisations. There are political leaderships which trade on fear and hatred. So developing an adequate response to the problems of gender and health is not just a cognitive exercise. It is also, to some extent, an exercise in courage and being willing to face what I think are very difficult but ultimately solvable issues. Thank you.
Raewyn, thank you so much for that astonishingly broad sweep of both history and theory, and just reminding all of us of the incredibly rich story that underlies what seems like a very simple question at the beginning. What's the relationship between gender and health, and what do we do about that relationship? And you have reminded us again and again of the complexity, but also of the possibilities to address that question and to think about that question in a variety of different ways. So I'm going to move immediately to a couple of questions that have come in on the chat. So here's one from Asha George, who I believe is based in South Africa, unless she's been able to travel outside at the moment. And Asha writes, most advances in gender equality are from women's civil society and social movements. Yet gender and health is led by technocrats. How can frontline voices co-direct knowledge projects as opposed to just being tokens within such projects?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I think the answer is not an easy one, and it's not a technical one either. It is in fact a political one. It's about where power lies in the economy, the institutional systems, the states that are dealing with health issues, and how power can be generated from below. It's easy for me to say. Of course, I'm an academic, I'm a knowledge worker, I'm not on the front line. All I can suggest really is that is an issue about how power can be generated from below through unions, social movements, professional organizations, health consumer organizations, all of those kinds of groups and organizations and processes are likely to be involved. And ultimately, of course, political parties. We have to, if we really want to open up these issues, we have to engage in that territory as well.
Thank you, Raewyn. I've got one last question before, unfortunately, I suspect we could be here for many hours with the variety of questions that are coming in. But one last question that has come from Jenny Gamlin in the UK. So she asks, can you suggest how different global knowledge about COVID may have been had Southern theorists had a leading role in defining how global health institutions have managed the pandemic?
That's also a wonderful question. It invites me to a little bit of science fiction, but I do think that knowledge workers in the global south would have put a lot more emphasis on community-based responses and on the knowledge that can be mobilized from communities which are organized to and confident about responding to new problems. Where power and knowledge and decision-making is concentrated among powerful, wealthy and highly educated people, a consequence is a degree of disempowerment from people who have other perspectives and other knowledge resources. So we would have had a richer knowledge base, I think, and we may have had a very different shape to the public policy type responses, even though the biomedical response may not have been as strongly different as that.
Thank you, Raewyn. I mean, I think you've given us not just a fantastic sweep this morning, but also an incredible base on which we really start thinking about the construction of knowledge within the Lancet Commission. So I'm going to unfortunately have to draw this part of the seminar to a close. I would very much encourage everybody who is watching this morning. Well, first of all, I'd actually encourage everybody to go back and really re-watch this seminar, because I think there was so much information and so many ideas in there that I would really recommend at least a second, if not a third, watching in order to really get a full grip on everything that Raewyn has shared and provoked us with this morning or this evening. But I'd also just like to remind everybody that this is the start of our seminar series. In 2 weeks' time, we will be joined by Professor Olena Hankiewski, who will be talking about intersectionality and health. But for now, thank you very much indeed to everybody who's joined us on YouTube, and farewell. And please, all the commissioners, please stay on Zoom. Thanks.